All right, Miss Brent, begin.
Audiences first got to know Audrey Hepburn when she played a dancer in the 1952 film Secret People. But most audiences did not know Hepburn had a painful secret of her own.
Her mother had been a Nazi sympathizer. Her father, Joseph Rustin, was a Nazi agent. It created a problem that Audrey would have, this burden that Audrey would lug with her the rest of her life.
Audrey Hepburn's family lived in the Netherlands, and to make up for the sins of her parents, she did everything she could during World War II to help the resistance, including dancing to raise money to feed and clothe Jews in hiding.
There are any number of times when she almost died. Somebody, probably a German soldier, shoved her under a tank as the bullets stitched past. And then she lived through the hunger winter, so it's a miracle in a way when you add it all up.
Later in life, the indignities Hepburn experienced during the war turned her into a tireless humanitarian, traveling the world as a special ambassador for the United Nations Children's Relief Organization known as UNICEF.
UNICEF thought they were going to get this pretty face, and what they got was a badass soldier who insisted on going into war zones, civil wars, the dangerous conditions on all of these missions. And she insisted on going in there because there were children who were like her, who were victims of wars started by adults.
Now, a new biography reveals the wartime experiences that made Audrey Hepburn's life more difficult and yet more meaningful.
She wouldn't tell stories about Hollywood when she wanted to make a point about doing the right thing and, growing up the right way. She talked about the war. That's the thing that was the most important time of her life.
Well, Robert Matzen, welcome to St. Louis.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So, Dutch Girl, we were just having a little discussion in the studio before you arrived, and I thought maybe I was the only one, but I'm obviously not. Audrey Hepburn was Dutch. I think, at least I assumed she was British.
Audrey was born in Belgium, and she spent her first few years in Belgium, and then she ended up in England, where she was educated in elementary school, basically. And so she was there until the age of 10, which is why she has kind of a British accent. Then she went to the Netherlands in 1939 at the end of the year because it was safer in the Netherlands because Hitler wasn't going to invade the Netherlands. That was the theory. Pretty soon, Hitler invaded the Low Countries, of which the Netherlands is probably the lowest of them. And so all of a sudden, Audrey at age 11 is under occupation in the Netherlands, where she would spend the entire war.
Hitler, I assume, thought he'd get very little resistance in the Netherlands?
Yeah, and they put up a pretty good scrap, even though, they surrendered in a matter of days, but they bloodied the Germans. The German army now has this sort of invincible vibe about it. But really, when the Germans threw themselves at a country, they threw everything at it. It wasn't like they had, grand armies waiting in the background. So it took all their resources to go through the Netherlands into France. And they got bloodied, and that they had to sort of recover from that. And I always thought that was very interesting, that now we have, the might of the German army. Well, they really stretched themselves to the limit.
Well, and really a discussion of Audrey Hepburn in World War II has to begin with her mother and Nazis, because there was a connection there.
Yeah, that's where I start the narrative, was with her mother, Ella von Heemstra. She's one of the Dutch von Heemstras in an aristocratic family. And she was sort of the black sheep of the family, and she was enamored of Hitler. She met Hitler in his office. And it created a problem that Audrey would have, this burden that Audrey would lug with her the rest of her life, that her mother had been a Nazi sympathizer. Her father, Joseph Rustin, was a Nazi agent who was arrested when war broke out with England and put in prison for the entire war. That's quite a burden for somebody.
she had to deal with that the rest of her life, really.
Yeah, and that's why nobody had written a book about it, because she wouldn't talk about it. And because while she was alive, certainly no one dared talk about the fact that her parents were Nazis. And so when I stumbled upon this topic, I was working on a book on Jimmy Stewart in the 8th Air Force, and I stumbled upon the fact that Audrey was in Arnhem in the Netherlands through the war. Well, that's pretty interesting. But nobody had written a book about that. Now, why? It was because she wouldn't talk about it.
Which is sort of astounding. I mean, I guess it's understandable since she wouldn't talk about it, but you had mentioned somewhere along the line that there's something like 1,000 titles of material. If you go and look up Audrey Hepburn on Google, it would seem like there's nothing left to say or to write about, but you certainly found something.
I did, and I can't believe it was me. I can't believe I got to do it, you know, and I feel that way about so many things that, you know, biographers sort of tripped over this thing that, oh, well, she lived through World War II. Well, that's not very interesting, you know, and then they would go and write about Breakfast at Tiffany's or whatever. So, you know, I had this whole, you know, rich vein of material to go access.
But the truth is, there's another word there. She barely lived through World War II.
That's a great point. You know, there are any number of times when she almost died. You know, she could have been strafed by a British Spitfire. She talks about one incident where she's walking down the main street of her town, Vellup, which is right near Arnhem, and it was the main east-west route where the German army came through. So it was always under attack. And the only way she got saved on that particular day was that somebody, probably a German soldier, shoved her under a tank as the bullets stitched past. You know, that's just one time. And she was arrested by the Green Police, which is the same police that arrested Anne Frank and her family. And she was going to be sent to Berlin, you know, as kitchen help. And she escaped, or she would have been in Berlin for the Soviet advance, you know, on the final days of the war. So, and then she lived through the Hunger Winter. So it's a miracle in a way when you add it all up.
We began by saying that there's this misconception, perhaps by some people, that she was actually British. I suppose that people also think of her more as an actress, but she thought of herself more as a dancer.
Yeah, she was a dancer through the course of her life. If you wanted to talk about her acting and you wanted to give her accolades about her acting, she would say, I'm not an actress, or, you know, you're being very kind, but, you know, I'm a dancer. And that's where she started in Arnhem. She became the most famous ballerina in Arnhem. When she couldn't dance publicly anymore, she danced privately and raised money for the resistance.
How did she come to dance for the resistance? And I would imagine that was pretty risky.
It was risky. It was risky more for the family, because they weren't going to take a 15-year-old girl out and shoot her, but they could certainly send the family away. I will tell you the spoiler, okay? Her uncle was shot by the Nazis. He was executed. He was a district attorney in Arnhem, and he was executed. And that changed the dynamic in the family, and it set everyone against, even Ella, her mother, by this point, had turned against the Nazis. And so Audrey and her family met a very charismatic doctor in the town that she lived in, who was a resistance leader. And he recruited Audrey to start doing things on behalf of the resistance, and that got her into it. And she did any number of things, the most important of which was to dance and raise money for people in hiding, who were mostly Jews who were hiding all over Velp, all over the Netherlands. But they had to be fed and clothed, and that's what Audrey could contribute.
Well, and if it's not too much of a spoiler, you mentioned Anne Frank a little while ago. There's a connection there in this story.
There are a number of connections between Audrey Hepburn and Anne Frank. They spent the war 60 miles apart, 100 kilometers, you know, Audrey in Arnhem and Anne in Amsterdam. They were both arrested by the Green Police. They both spent the war like dodging the Green Police and staying out of trouble. And of course, the Frank family was you know, hiding away for a year, 22 months or whatever. They were both arrested by the Green Police, and Anne and her family were taken away, and only one survived. Right after the war, Audrey and her mother moved to Amsterdam, where Audrey could pick up her ballet career again. And they happened to live in the same apartment building as the editor who was working on Het Achterhuis, which was the diary. And Audrey read the diary before it was published, and it devastated her, because all of a sudden she's got survivor's guilt and you know, on top of everything else.
And then later in life had the opportunity to play her in the movie, but chose not to.
Exactly. That's 10 years later. You know, flash forward 10 years, and Otto Frank, the only survivor, asks Audrey personally, you know, courts Audrey, looks her in the eye, please play my daughter in a movie. She says, no, I can't do it. You know, I can't take money for it. I can't relive the war. Don't ask me to do it. And she didn't do it. And it wasn't until another 30 years, she finally performs in public some portions of the diary, and that's to raise money for UNICEF.
If she wouldn't talk about this, and it doesn't sound like the sort of thing that there would be a lot of records of, how in the world did you find all this out?
Really, it was the children. It was the people about her age who were left in Arnhem Envelop that I could talk to. And I sat down with them, and they really opened my eyes to, you know, how brutal it was there, especially around the Battle of Arnhem, the Bridge Too Far battle, where 10,000 British paratroopers, you know, drop on everybody's heads and start this tremendous battle that's a terrible defeat for the British. I interviewed a number of those people, and I also went into the archives, the National Dutch Archives, where there is a secret police file on Ella van Heemstra, which was critical. And so I had those things. I spent a lot of time in the Netherlands on the ground doing this research, and then I got hooked up with Audrey's son, Luca. And he filled in blanks for me. I filled in blanks for him. You know, we formed this sort of partnership, and we're kind of like brothers now, and it's really, that part's very cool.
You were finding out things that he didn't even know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why he was very anxious to meet me and to read the manuscript, because, you know, he had a project he was working on at the time about his mother, and my research turned out to be very critical, and it was just this synergy that, boy, I didn't expect, and I guess he didn't expect, and everything has come together pretty nicely.
She clearly didn't talk about it publicly, but was it something she even talked about privately with him?
Yeah, she talked to both sons about the war quite a bit, you know. Lessons you can learn, my son, you know, and it's really all about the war. And he said, he made a big point of that she wouldn't tell stories about Hollywood when she wanted to make a point about doing the right thing and, you know, growing up the right way. She talked about the war. You know, that's the thing that was the most important time of her life.
And I suppose anybody in their right mind would want to hide the fact that their parents had some connections with the Nazis, but particularly for an actress in Hollywood, that would have been a career ender. I assume she was not only not talking about it, was probably terrified someone would find out.
Yeah, but it wasn't, you know, she never had this film career focus, really. What she had was a need to protect her mother, family honor, you know. Even though she despised what her mother had done and what her mother had been, she still felt the duty to protect her. And she did that, you know, remarkably well through the course of her mother's life, and then through those last years when her mother was gone, she still wouldn't talk about it.
And really didn't until, you know, ever.
Ever.
It must have been very painful for her. Was it the sort of thing, I mean, it's almost like PTSD that followed her through her life, thinking back on these memories?
Very strong, you know, indications of PTSD, yes. You know, and her son Luca talked about that quite a bit when we were in the Netherlands a couple of months ago. You know, that certain sounds would get to her. You know, certain smells would get to her. You know, she would be, all of a sudden, she would be back in the middle of the war. You know, she would have to run out of the room, that kind of thing. So yeah, and there were nightmares, and she talked about the nightmares of seeing Jewish faces in cattle cars, you know. So yeah, a lot of PTSD type activity.
What was it like trying to get this information and find the right people? Because I gather the Dutch are sort of a rather stoic bunch. Here comes this American waltzing in saying, hey, tell me about Audrey. It took a little while to get folks to open up, I would imagine.
It's a great question. You know, it's one of the reasons why when my foreign rights agent would shop this book around the world, it got picked up here and there, no problem. But the Dutch, they didn't want anything to do with an American author. You know, this is a Dutch story that should be told by a Dutchman. But I'm sorry, I did it. Once these people know you, they're very suspicious at first, but once they know you and accept you and understand, you know, get your vibe and it's okay, then it's fine. I have Dutch family there. There are people there now who my wife and I are just crazy about, and they're crazy about us. I mean, it's just become a family situation, and that's, you know, I think that's just the nature of Audrey Hepburn and what how positive she was, what her outlook was, and this project has been so positive, and so it's been a joy for everybody, I think.
You learned to speak some Dutch, right?
I did a bit of Dutch, but it was always embarrassing.
Just enough to be courteous and make an effort, but not enough to really converse with somebody.
Yeah, really. To say,
but sometimes that's all it takes.
To say, I respect you, I respect your culture, I respect your language. But they just laughed at me, or they just said, what? Just speak English. That's what they did.
You mentioned briefly about the hunger that she went through in that one particular winter that also stuck with her the rest of her life, not only mentally, but physically.
Yeah. The last winter of the war, after the Battle of Arnhem, the Germans cut off food to the entire Netherlands, and it created a dire situation of famine. Like 20,000 people died. Audrey developed anemia, edema, asthma, these serious health problems, and was in, within weeks of being, if not dead, then gravely ill. In fact, a lot of the people I talked to who were her age, had to be sent out of the country after the war, to be seriously hospitalized, where they're in like Sweden, where facilities were better. That's how bad it was. And she had stretch marks on her ankles her entire life from the swelling of the edema that had worked its way up her legs.
Well, she was always pretty thin, too. Is that any kind of result of this, do you think?
She had a very uneasy relationship with food after the war. And there are studies that people in that situation never quite regulate themselves again. She would put on a lot of weight, then she would have to lose a lot of weight, and that messed her up. And then suddenly it's the 1960s, and she's found that the only way to really control it, to control her weight for the films and whatever, is to eat, 1 piece of wheat bread and 1 cup of yogurt and 3 strips of asparagus, and that would be her food for the day. And so she never quite got it right. And then the lower GI tract is where the cancer developed. Is it a coincidence? I can't prove it one way or the other, but it's interesting.
But your sense is that may be what killed her.
Yeah, that it was the war that finally, the bullet found her after 45 years.
It did have some positive influence on her life, or at least it influenced her to make positive changes in other people's lives through her work through UNICEF. It's all of a piece, right? It's all tied together.
Absolutely. So the war ends, and it's the UNRRA, which is the precursor to UNICEF, brings food in and clothing and whatever. And Audrey sees that and benefits from it, and she pays it forward. It took her a long time. Once she was through with her career, it was always with her. There are little UNICEF things that she did, I think, going back to, years before her official involvement. And yeah, she demanded, once she became involved with UNICEF, Lucas said to me, UNICEF thought they were going to get this pretty face. And what they got was a badass soldier who insisted on going into war zones, civil wars, the dangerous conditions on all of these missions. And she insisted on going in there because there were children who were like her, who were victims of wars started by adults.
And was she also, at that point, kind of fearless because of her experience?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, she was fearless because, not because of her experience so much as because of the need at the other end. The children are there. I don't care what color they are, whatever, they need me, and that's where I'm going.
You, if I understand it correctly, sort of stumbled into this story because you've been involved with the Hollywood Trilogy, I guess it's called. I don't know if that's how it actually started out or if it just ended up 3 and said, okay, that's great, we got a trilogy. But this actually came out of a book about Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah, so I was in the Netherlands for that, and I had done one before that on Carol Lombard's plane crash in Las Vegas, and she was on a war bond tour right after the war. You're exactly right. I don't even know what you call it when you have 4 books. It's a quad something, a G, I don't know. But Trilogy's got a nice ring to it, and I ran out of good stories, so it became a trilogy.
So if you find another one, you just have to pass it off to somebody else?
Yeah, or trilogy plus 1, I guess.
But you enjoy writing about that period in particular, and about Hollywood in particular.
Yeah, I'm a Hollywood guy, I'm a history guy. My dad gave me both things. It's all his fault. And I have been very fortunate to find these stories that nobody had told, but were so richly dramatic and needed to be told. And I just follow that.
Well, there's the additional hook that it's somebody famous that people think they know, and they didn't know this whole side of their life. That's so fascinating.
Yeah, and when you get to Audrey, you know, that's the gold standard. You know, all of a sudden you've got, you know, People magazine doing a cover story on your book, and you've got Fox News wanting you national, taking you, you know, picking you up in a car and making you up for 45 minutes, which of course I needed. But it's hard now. What do you do next? How do you follow Audrey Hepburn? What are you going to do? Louis Hayward, or I don't even know. You know, so that's the curse of it. That's the downside.
Well, especially when you're picking people that so much has been written about, and a war on top of it has been, you know, written about for decades, to think that there's anything left to uncover, and yet you did.
Well, yeah, when this thing was ready to go to press, you know, my publicist said, well, not only, you know, do you have Audrey Hepburn, but you've got World War II, which is really hot right now. And I'm like, okay. I mean, it's just, timing has just come together very nicely on this one, you know, even more so than the others.
Well, it's a really competitive landscape out there in publishing, probably even more now than ever.
It is. You know, it's almost impossible to get noticed out there. And so, yeah, this has been just a terrific year.
Was this the most difficult of the trilogy to research and write?
Yes, because, you know, it's the international part of it. You know, you have to go overseas, and everything, all of the key documents were in Dutch. You know, it's to my benefit that many of the Dutch peoples, most of them speak English, at least passing. But the Dutch documents was a challenge. Getting access to those documents was a challenge.
I know they were reticent at first. Are many of them grateful now that the story has finally been told?
Yeah. When Dutch Girl launched its Dutch edition in September, it was a national event. You know, it was on national television, national radio, the newspapers, all over. It was really big, and there was a commemorative event at the site of her house. Luca and I were there to unveil a statue that was inspired by the book, so those were good times.
Now, she has two sons. The other son is shown by another father, Melvin Ferrer, as I recall.
That's right.
Who was not especially cooperative with the book, is that correct?
That's correct. He, when you start page one with his grandmother shaking Hitler's hand, you know, that's all he wanted to read, and that was it. And I respect that. It's a secret that he felt he needed to continue to protect on behalf of his mother, and luckily Luca felt differently.
Was she proud of what she had done? I know she didn't talk about it much, but did Luca have a sense that she was proud of what she had done?
He told a story that had not been published anywhere, that after the Battle of Arnhem, one of the Tommies, one of the British paratroopers, was hidden in the cellar of their home for a week. The resistance put him there, trusting that the family would take care of him. That was the proudest moment of her war. She was more proud of that than delivering messages to downed airmen, than dancing for the resistance, than delivering the resistance newspaper. It was having that liberator in her cellar that was the biggest thing to her. And that just says to me, she was very proud of working for the resistance and doing the right thing in the war.
Had others tried to tell a story, approached her or approached Luca or Sean to try to get the story out there earlier?
No. The best biography I've seen of her is by Barry Paris. It was completely authorized. You know, he had full access to the family, and he had a researcher on the ground in the Netherlands. But if you're not there, you know, if you're not, you know, pounding the pavement actually there, you can't get that much access. I don't know that 20 years ago that Sean or Luca was ready for this story to be told, but Luca now is. So the combination of me actually being there and finding what I did find, which proved to him that I was serious, I was a meticulous researcher, I could be trusted to tell the story the right way. You know, that got Luca on board, I think. And so yeah, I was the first.
By being so meticulous, did you find that a lot of the biographies that had been written about her before actually had erroneous information in them?
Bingo. Almost every page of the past books had things wrong, because one would believe what, they would build upon this false foundation of research, and yeah, there were a lot of sort of legends that had sprung up that really weren't based in fact.
Just one last question. Because she was so reticent to talk about it, do you ever ask yourself what she would think about the fact that now that she's gone, that this story is coming out?
That was asked of Luca and me sitting in Velp at the book launch there, and I gave an answer that was just me talking. But then Luca said she would say it was okay because this was the right way to tell it. It wasn't sensational. It was like, this is the time. He honestly felt, he feels the spirit of his mother pretty closely, and he felt that she would think it was for the good, that the world needs to hear this now.
Well, and thanks to you, the world is. Robert Matzen, thanks very much. Enjoy your time in St. Louis.
Thank you, Paul.